This is Jason Reed Pratt, author of, flash book cover briefly, Cry of Justice. Have you ever needed to learn how to play the board game Churchill from GMT Games? No, you haven't. You need air and food and water and fellowship with foundational love and justice, but you do not need to learn how to play a board game. Man, this introduction got off badly. Let's try another take. Have you ever wanted to learn how to play the board game Churchill from GMT Games? Me too! Have you noticed that the middle of my title card reads, "When Lions Roared"? That's because Churchill, the political strategy game published by GMT Games and designed by, find out who that is and put it here, is actually, for all practical purposes, a board game adaptation of the second half of the award-winning television miniseries by that name. Show scenes from the trailer here or something. Released in 1994 for some channel that I have not been able to discover yet, this two-part set of 90-minute films traces the history of World War II from start to finish, or through the fall of Nazi Germany anyway, through the eyes and strategic political maneuvering of Joseph Stalin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and, most especially, Winston Churchill. It's a documentary drama staged as a theatrical play. There's a legend floating around the internet that originally it was a 12-hour play, which takes its principal dialogue as much as possible from things actually said by its three protagonists. For some reason I have been too lazy to discover yet, this game is called Churchill instead. But despite that name, this is not a solitary game where you play Winston Churchill juggling a political career at home while overseeing military operations and finagling cooperation from allies and enemies abroad. This is a game where up to 3 players finagle cooperation from allies and enemies abroad, while also, in a very broad way, managing the offensive operations against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. And against Italy, I guess. They have a piece on the board somewhere. There are rules to play the game with 1 or 2 players versus bots, but because I like to write novels, I keep myself in dramatic exercise, sometimes, by playing different characters against each other in asymmetric games, which is a fancy way of saying games where the characters have different abilities and restrictions from each other. Chess, not asymmetric. Churchill, kind of not really asymmetric, but sort of. Consequently, since a guy with an unpronounceable face name, not joking, looks like this, went to the trouble of porting a vassal module of this game to Tabletop Simulator, I have chosen it as my first video series. But enough blathering! Time for more blathering. I'll be explaining later how to play the game as we go along, starting next time in the first episode, since this is really episode 0, and so exists as a conceptual and thus spiritual reality, manifested in electronic impulses of various kinds. Much like episode 1, come to think of it. And episode 2, and episode 3. What I will do here in episode 0 is set up a campaign game and explain very broadly what we'll be doing, whereby we, I mean the 3 fictional characters whom I'll all be playing. You will be watching, laughing at me, moving on to some other video out of boredom, etc. If, however, you decide you have friends who would like to play this game with you, and vice versa, please visit GMT Games at the link in my description and place an order for this fine game, seriously. Keeping in mind you're going to get a huge heavy box with cards, and wood blocks, and plastic pieces, and lots of various grades of paper, and not electronic impulses, except at the subatomic level, unlike what you're seeing here. Roughly speaking, the goal of the game is to have the most victory points when the game finally grinds to a halt, which are tracked by colored pieces representing each faction on this track. I say roughly speaking because it is entirely possible, by luck and or by some sterling gameplay, to win the game because you came in second place. Or even to win the game because you came in last, if you're playing Churchill and you thread that needle precisely. I would say it's that kind of game, except I can't recall any other game that allows this. I feel pretty safe in saying there can't be that many of that kind of game. Roughly speaking, by a lot of different ways. Too many to summarize here. But Basically, what you're doing is attending up to 10 political conferences in the second half of World War II and trying to work out among yourselves how to coordinate in beating the Axis powers and how much influence you'll have in the world after you all win. Because this is a game where all three players are going to win. The Axis powers are going to lose sooner or later. You're competing against each other and cooperating with each other to win. The designer calls this co-ompative gameplay, I think. It isn't a war game. It's a political strategy game about managing the most important war in history together, even though one of you is a tyrannical madman just as bad or arguably worse than the other tyrants you're dropping the hammer on. That's Stalin. When you finish watching When Lions Roared in his sympathetic but irascible portrayal by Michael Caine of all people, which admittedly is a work of genius, go watch the documentary Russia's War, Blood on the Snow, for what was really going on over in Uncle Joe land. I'll show you what a political strategy game about conferences means as we go along. Let's set up the board. First, the conference table. Well, I've already set up the conference table. I'll explain what all those things mean later. It's conference-y. Also, there will be card playing. Next, the Pacific Theater. Something to do. Place 1 naval support marker at the Central Pacific Front, 3 naval supports at the Southwest Pacific Front, and put a U.S. leadership marker in the Pacific leadership space. Also, the front markers at the opening space of each front. To the European Theater. Rather more things to do here. Put 1 naval at the start of the Mediterranean front, the UK marker in European leadership, the US A-bomb research tracker in its first slot, letter to Roosevelt, the USS spy marker also there, and the front markers for the UK, US, and Stalin go here, there, and yon. To the conference cards. Here we see 10 stacks, although that isn't obvious in Tabletop Simulator, so let me pull 2 off the top for Conference 1. See, there are 3 versions of the first conference, codename symbol, and that's true for each of the other 9 conferences too. We're going to stack these back up, flip them over, shuffle them 7 times, draw 1 off, set it over here, and go down the line doing that. To be honest, this is backward for how the rules describe it, but the end result will be the same. 1 random version of each conference in historical order, except instead of drawing off the top, we'll flip the deck over and voila, there's this game's version of symbol. That'll kick off the first turn, and when we get to the second turn, we'll draw that off and reveal Conference 2, and so on. Last and not least, Churchill instantly gets 10 victory points. Because he's Churchill! And also because the UK gets 2 victory points for every British colony that is clean of political influence and spy networks, including their own. The UK would really prefer not to be imposing on their colonies, since that's how revolutions happen. They will still score for putting spies and political influence into their colonies if they choose to, but they'll lose this score if they do. This can be calced at the end of the game instead, but other victory point calcs happen as they're achieved, so we might as well start here. Also, because he's Churchill! Finally, which is like last, but more final, I would have had each faction draw 3 secret agendas from the secret agenda bag. But the modder hasn't put that in yet, and neither have I in my private copy. So the score is the score as we go along. That's the setup. Axis military cubes actually get assigned around after the game starts, so that will be later in Episode 1, which will be next time. When whatever else happens, one thing will be sure. I will lose. Twice. Doom, 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 doom. Amen. 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 Amen.